He was born to inherit one of the most powerful thrones on earth, destined to be the absolute ruler of the sprawling Austrian Empire. Yet he is remembered by history, if at all, as a simpleton, a puppet, and a ghost in his own palace, crushed by the ambitions of his own wife and son. At the single most critical moment, with his empire in flames and the crown offered to him on a platter, he did the unthinkable. He refused. His name was Archduke Franz Karl. How did the man who held the fate of Europe in his hands become a powerless footnote? And how did this one act of surrender, this great escape from duty, set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead to the annihilation of his entire dynasty? His crushing was inevitable. Franz Karl was a man trapped between two irreconcilable realities: the simple, peaceful world he desired and the brutal, dying empire he was born to rule. The Austrian Empire of the early 19th century was a vast, sprawling, and deeply troubled entity. It was an empire of contradictions, a mosaic of dozens of nationalities, languages, and religions, all held together by the iron will of the Habsburg crown and the suffocating bureaucracy that served it. This was the Old Guard, a world forged in the fires of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Franz Karl's father, Emperor Francis I, was a man traumatized by his times. He had witnessed the execution of his aunt, Marie Antoinette. He had fought and lost devastating wars against Napoleon, ceding vast territories, and even being forced to marry his own daughter, Marie Louise, to the French usurper. These experiences forged in him a paranoid, almost pathological conservatism. He saw the ideals of the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, fraternity, not as progress, but as a plague that would dissolve his realm. His solution was to turn the Austrian Empire into a fortress against new ideas. This era, known as the Biedermeier period, was characterized on the surface by a retreat into domestic life, art, and simple pleasures. But this was a facade. Beneath this veneer of peacefulness lay the iron grip of the state, engineered by the true master of Austria, Prince Clemens von Metternich. Metternich, the foreign minister and later state chancellor, was the architect of this conservative order. He established one of the most sophisticated police states in Europe. A vast network of spies and informants listened in on conversations in cafes, universities, and private homes. Censorship was absolute. Every book, every play, every newspaper was scrutinized for the slightest hint of liberalism or nationalism. Universities were put under strict surveillance, their professors and students monitored, lest they become hotbeds of dissent. Francis I famously said his ideal citizen was not a thinking man, but a loyal subject. This was the world Franz Karl grew up in, a gilded cage of rigid hierarchies, paranoid suspicion, and an enforced suffocating silence. It was an empire that prioritized stability above all else, resisting progress at every turn, a system designed to freeze time. But time, of course, refuses to be frozen. The threats to this brittle order were growing, both from without and within. Externally, the Napoleonic Wars had redrawn the map of Europe, and more importantly, had unleashed the potent, unstoppable force of nationalism. Within the Austrian Empire, this was a ticking time bomb. The Hungarians, with their proud, distinct history, chafed under Viennese rule. The Italians in Lombardy, Venetia dreamed of a united Italy. The Czechs in Bohemia, the Poles in Galicia, the Croats in the south, all were beginning to awaken to their own national identities, their own languages, and their own desires for autonomy. The empire, which drew its strength from its diversity, was now being threatened with dissolution by that very same diversity. The internal threats were just as grave and they struck at the very heart of the dynasty, its blood. The Habsburg practice of inbreeding had become a catastrophic liability. This leads us directly to Archduke Ferdinand, Franz Karl's older brother. It is difficult to overstate Ferdinand's incapacity. His condition was an open secret. He suffered from frequent and severe epileptic seizures. He had hydrocephalus, or water on the brain, which left his head enlarged. He spoke with a severe speech impediment that made him nearly impossible to understand. While good-natured, he was known as Ferdinand the Benign. He was, for all intents and purposes, intellectually disabled. He famously, upon being told he couldn't have his favorite apricot dumplings because they were out of season, shouted at his cook, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." It was a scene that perfectly captured the tragic absurdity of his reign. When Emperor Francis I died in 1835, the ascension of Ferdinand I was a disaster. It created an immediate power vacuum. The empire was now in effect rudderless. A regency council, or Staatskonferenz, was established to rule in Ferdinand's name. This council was a viper's nest of infighting, primarily between the arch-conservative Metternich, who dominated foreign policy, and his ambitious rival, Count Franz Anton von Kolowrat-Liebsztyński, who controlled domestic affairs and finances. They despised each other and paralyzed the government, fighting over trivial matters while the empire's real problems, failing harvests, economic stagnation, and rising nationalism, festered. This is the need for change that defined the era. The old system was failing not just because it was politically outdated, but because it was biologically collapsing. The Habsburg monarchy was brittle, its leadership feeble and locked in a stalemate. The desperation for renewal was palpable. And where did that leave Franz Karl? With Ferdinand clearly sterile, the court's eyes and the empire's hopes turned to the next brother in line. They turned to the gentle, unambitious, and wholly unprepared Archduke Franz Karl. The entire future of the Habsburg dynasty, its very survival, now rested on his ability to produce a healthy male heir. The pressure was immense, and it was into this high-stakes, desperate environment that a new, formidable player was about to make her entrance, a woman who would not only fill the power vacuum, but would come to dominate it completely, Archduchess Sophie of Bavaria. Into this world of rigid tradition and simmering crisis stepped Franz Karl, a man who, by his very nature, was the polar opposite of the old guard, and everything the Habsburg dynasty expected of its princes. He was in essence a mold breaker, but not through rebellion or reform. He broke the mold through his sheer, profound absence of ambition. Unlike his paranoid father or the cunning Metternich, Franz Karl was described by almost all his contemporaries as gentle, good-natured, and utterly unambitious. But they also used other words: feeble-minded, intellectually limited, indecisive. Whether he suffered from a genuine intellectual disability, a consequence of the same inbreeding that so afflicted his brother, or whether he was simply a painfully shy, poorly educated man overshadowed by the giants around him, the result was the same. He was perceived as weak. His passions were simple and decidedly apolitical. He despised the complex intrigues of the Vienna court, finding them baffling and stressful. His only true passion, the one place he felt alive and competent, was the hunt. He would spend weeks, even months, away from the palace, pursuing deer and boar, finding in the clear, uncomplicated rules of the forest a solace he could never find in the council chambers. In this, he was not just a prince who shunned power, he was a man actively fleeing from it. His vision for his own life was not one of imperial glory, but of quiet, domestic peace. He wanted a life of leisure, family, and religious observance, far from the burdens of a throne he never desired and was terrified to one day inherit. His small personal circle reflected this. He didn't build a shadow court of political allies. He surrounded himself with personal aides and hunting companions who reinforced his apolitical life. He relied on his brothers, like Archduke Karl Ludwig, for support, but his primary advisor, the person who would become his de facto will, was his wife. And this is where the story truly pivots. The court, and especially Metternich, recognized the dynastic crisis. Ferdinand was childless. Franz Karl was the heir. The Staatskonferenz and the late Emperor Francis I knew that the single most important task was to find a wife for this passive prince, a woman who could manage him and, most importantly, produce a healthy son to secure the succession. The search led them to the kingdom of Bavaria, and to a young princess who was everything Franz Karl was not. Enter Archduchess Sophie of Bavaria. When she married Franz Karl in 1824, she was just 19 years old. He was 22. She was a member of the ancient house of Wittelsbach, a princess renowned for her intelligence, her sharp wit, her iron will, and her burning ambition. Contemporaries noted her beauty, but they feared her mind. She was deeply religious, deeply conservative, and possessed a political acumen that rivaled Metternich's. She was in spirit more Habsburg than the man she married. We can only imagine her private thoughts when she met her new husband. Court rumors suggest she was privately dismayed by his simplicity, his lack of intellectual curiosity, and his timid passivity. But Sophie was a pragmatist. She did not see Franz Karl as a partner. She saw him as a stepping stone. She understood his position in the line of succession with perfect, chilling clarity. She knew her husband would never be a strong ruler. She knew he would likely crumble under the pressure. And so, from the moment she arrived at the Austrian court, she began to formulate her own vision. She would be the spine he lacked. She would guide him, protect him, and manage his public image. And she would dedicate her entire existence to one singular goal: to conceive a son and ensure that he, not her husband, would one day sit on the imperial throne. Sophie became the ultimate foil to Franz Karl. He represented the path of passive withdrawal, of rejecting the burdens of power. She represented the path of calculated, ruthless power-grabbing. She thrived on the very court intrigue that he fled from. She began meticulously building her own shadow court, not of hunting companions, but of influential courtiers, clergymen, and politicians who saw her as the true conservative force within the imperial family. She effectively turned her husband's household into her own political headquarters. Sophie's influence grew rapidly, eclipsing her husband's entirely. He relied on her for everything, from political opinions to social engagements. She became his shield, his advisor, and his master. The quiet, gentle prince who just wanted a life of peace was now inextricably bound to a woman who was preparing for war, a political war for the future of the empire, a war she intended to win through their future child. The stage was set, the key players were in place, and the tragicomedy of Franz Karl's life was about to enter its most fateful act. Archduchess Sophie's arrival at the Habsburg court was like a bolt of lightning striking a placid, stagnant lake. She was not merely a new bride, she was a force of nature, and she immediately understood the dynamics of her new family. She saw the pathetic weakness of the reigning Emperor Ferdinand, the paralysis of the Staatskonferenz, and the gentle, frustrating passivity of her own husband, Franz Karl. For the first several years of her marriage, her ambition was channeled into a singular biological imperative. She had to produce and heir. The early years were fraught with anxiety. It took 6 long years, filled with miscarriages and dynastic desperation, before she finally succeeded. In 1830, she gave birth to a healthy son, Franz Joseph. This was not just a birth, it was a political victory. She followed this with Ferdinand Maximilian in 1832 and Karl Ludwig in 1833. She had done her duty. She had provided the dynasty with not one, but 3 healthy male heirs, bypassing the genetic weaknesses of the current generation. She had created her shadow emperor, and from the moment of Franz Joseph's birth, her entire life became a meticulously planned campaign to one day place him on the throne. She personally oversaw his education, instilling in him a rigid sense of duty, a deep Catholic piety, and an unshakable belief in autocratic divine right monarchy. She was, in effect, raising the emperor she wished she had married. And where was Franz Karl during this time? He was, as always, present but absent. He was a doting, affectionate father. Contemporaries noted that this was perhaps his one true joy. He loved his children in a simple, uncomplicated way that Sophie, who saw them as political assets, could not. He played with them, took them on walks, and shared in their simple pleasures. But in matters of their education, their future, their destiny, he had no say. Sophie was in total control. He was relegated to the role of a beloved family pet, a good-natured but irrelevant figurehead within his own home. This dynamic, Sophie as the iron-willed strategist, Franz Karl as the passive, agreeable consort, defined their household, and it would soon define the fate of the entire empire. The ticking bomb that had been planted by his brother's incapacity and his wife's ambition was about to explode, and the spark would come not from within the palace, but from the streets, from the very people the Habsburgs had tried so hard to ignore. The 1840s were a period of horrifying misery across Europe, and the Austrian Empire was no exception. This was the Hungry 40s, a series of catastrophic crop failures, including the same potato blight that was devastating Ireland, led to widespread famine, skyrocketing food prices, and mass unemployment. The Industrial Revolution, which was creating vast new wealth for a few, was also creating a desperate, impoverished, urban working class. In cities like Vienna, families starved in wretched slums, while just a few streets away the aristocracy continued their waltzes and opulent dinners. This powder keg of economic desperation and social inequality only needed a spark. That spark came in February 1848. News arrived in Vienna that in Paris the citizen king, Louis Philippe, had been overthrown and a republic had been declared. The news spread like wildfire, electrified the continent, and shattered the illusion of permanent conservative order that Metternich had spent his entire life building. If it could happen in Paris, the people whispered, why not in Vienna? On March 13, 1848, it happened. The March Revolution exploded. It began, as revolutions often do, with students. They gathered at the university drafting petitions and demanding what had been unthinkable just weeks before: a constitution, freedom of the press, trial by jury, and, most symbolic of all, the immediate resignation of Prince Metternich. They marched to the Landhaus, the seat of the provincial diet, and were joined by a swelling crowd of workers, artisans, and liberal members of the bourgeoisie, all united in their hatred of the old system. When the troops guarding the building panicked and fired into the crowd, killing several protesters, the city erupted in fury. Barricades went up. The arsenal was stormed. The streets of Vienna, the very heart of Habsburg power, became a war zone. For the imperial family, insulated within the Hofburg Palace, this was an apocalyptic shock. They could hear the roar of the crowd and the sound of gunfire. They were terrified. Emperor Ferdinand, in a state of confused panic, reportedly asked Metternich, "Are they allowed to do this?" The Staatskonferenz was paralyzed. They had no plan. They had spent decades suppressing dissent, and now that it was on their doorstep, they were completely, utterly overwhelmed. And what of Franz Karl? He was, as ever, a shadow. As a member of the Imperial Council, he was present for the panicked, frantic meetings, but records show him as a silent, terrified spectator. He was a man constitutionally incapable of decisive action, and in a moment that demanded nothing but decisive action, he simply faded into the wallpaper. He agreed with whatever was suggested, nodding along to proposals for concessions, a constitution, a new liberal ministry, anything to make the violence stop and restore the quiet he so craved. The one decisive action the family did take was a stunning admission of defeat. Under intense pressure from all sides, and with even the imperial family recognizing he had become a liability, Prince Metternich, the coachman of Europe, the architect of post-Napoleonic conservatism, the most powerful man in the empire for 30 years, resigned. He was forced to flee Vienna in disguise, smuggled out of the city in a laundry cart. His fall was a symbolic collapse of the entire old order. The revolution, it seemed, had won. The old guard had crumbled in a matter of days. In the intoxicating spring and summer of 1848, a wave of liberalism swept the empire. The government, now led by rattled liberals, dutifully drafted a constitution. Censorship was abolished. A new National Guard patrolled the streets. But this victory was an illusion. The imperial family, feeling unsafe in the Red City of Vienna, fled in May to the loyal conservative city of Innsbruck, a move that was both a humiliating retreat and a shrewd strategic maneuver. It was here, in the quiet mountains of Tyrol, far from the revolutionary fervor of the capital, that the counter-revolution was born, and its chief architect was Archduchess Sophie. While Franz Karl was likely relieved to be away from the chaos, enjoying the alpine scenery, Sophie was furious. She was humiliated. She saw the concessions to the liberals not as necessary reforms, but as a blasphemous surrender of God-given authority. She was not a spectator. She was a general. From Innsbruck, she began to spin her web. She formed what became known as the Camarilla, a secret conservative shadow government. She wrote constantly to the loyalist generals who were fighting to hold the empire together. General Radetzky, who was battling Italian nationalists in Lombardy, and, most importantly, Prince Alfred zu Windisch-Grätz, the commander in Prague. Windisch-Grätz was a man after her own heart, an arch-conservative aristocrat who despised the revolution. When a similar uprising occurred in Prague in June, he showed no hesitation, brutally bombarding the city into submission. Sophie was overjoyed. This was how one dealt with rebellion. She had found her enforcer. This brings us to the true crisis, the event that would seal Franz Karl's fate. The temporary peace was shattered in October 1848. The radicals in Vienna, rightly fearing the growing power of the Camarilla, rose up once more. The trigger was the government's attempt to send troops from Vienna to help crush the burgeoning revolution in Hungary. The Viennese soldiers, sympathizing with the Hungarians, refused. A massive, violent riot ensued. The radicals, now far more organized and desperate, stormed the Ministry of War and seized the Minister of War himself, Theodor Franz, Count Baillet von Latour. In a horrifying display of mob justice, they lynched him, stringing his mutilated body from a lamppost. This was no longer a liberal revolution. It was, in the eyes of the court, a descent into sheer terror. The imperial family, which had cautiously returned to the Vienna area, fled again. This time, They ran to the small fortified city of Olamuk in Moravia, which was under the secure protection of the army. Vienna was now in a state of open, armed rebellion against the crown. The empire was literally falling apart. It was in the damp, cold, and frightened halls of the archbishop's palace at Olamuk that the final drama unfolded. The situation was desperate. Vienna was in the hands of radicals. Hungary had declared virtual independence. The Italians were still fighting. And Emperor Ferdinand was a nonentity, a quivering, ineffectual man who had already promised the revolutionaries a constitution. To the Camarilla, to Sophie, to Prince Windisch-Grätz, to the conservative Prince Felix of Schwarzenberg, Ferdinand was worse than useless. He was a liability. His word was broken, his authority shattered. He had to go. This is when Sophie's long-term strategy, her years of meticulous planning, came to fruition. A new clean emperor was needed, someone untainted by the failures and concessions of 1848, someone who could represent a fresh, strong, and uncompromising restoration of imperial power. The legal heir, of course, was Franz Karl, but he was now, in the eyes of the Camarilla, completely unacceptable. He was seen as just as weak as his brother. He had sat silently by as Metternich fell. He was tainted by the same liberal concessions. He was, in short, a risk. But more importantly, Sophie knew her husband. She knew he would be a disastrous emperor. He would be indecisive, easily manipulated by liberal politicians, and utterly incapable of the ruthless action needed to save the empire. She did not want a weak husband on the throne, a man she would have to constantly manage. She wanted her son. Franz Joseph was perfect. He was 18 years old, young enough to be molded, but old enough to command. He was untainted by the crimes of the old regime. He could be presented to the people as a fresh start, a symbol of youthful vigor and renewed authority. And most importantly, he had been raised by her. He was her creation, imbued with her conservative, autocratic values. He would be the strong ruler she had always dreamed of. The pressure applied to Franz Karl in those cold November days must have been unendurable. It came from all sides, but it was most intense, most personal, and most irresistible coming from his own wife. We can only imagine the private, agonizing conversations, the scenes that took place behind closed doors. Sophie, the brilliant political strategist, would have used every tool at her disposal. She would have appealed to his logic. The empire needs a strong leader, my dear, and we both know you are not that man. You are too good, too gentle. She would have used emotional blackmail. Do this for your son. Do this for the dynasty. Do this for the future of our family, which is hanging by a thread. And, most powerfully, she would have appealed to his own deepest, most fundamental nature. This is your escape. This is your freedom. You sign this paper, and the burden you have dreaded your entire life will be lifted. You can have the quiet you've always wanted. You can go hunting. You can be at peace. Let Franzl take the weight. He is strong. He is ready. It was an offer he couldn't refuse because it was everything he had ever wanted. The abdication was his decisive action, a purely passive act that was nonetheless the most game-changing moment of his life. On December 2nd, 1848, as the cannons of Windisch-Grätz were bombarding the defeated city of Vienna, the imperial family gathered in a tense, somber ceremony at the archbishop's palace in Olamuk. It was not a grand public affair, but a cold, transactional family meeting. First, Emperor Ferdinand I, prompted and guided by his handlers, formally abdicated the throne, citing his failing health. Then all eyes in the room turned to Archduke Franz Karl. He was, for that brief moment, the de jure Emperor of Austria. He stood, and in his reportedly flat, unemotional voice, he read his own declaration of renunciation, stepping aside in favor of his eldest son. In that instant, 18-year-old Franz Joseph was proclaimed Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria. Legend says the new young emperor knelt before his uncle Ferdinand, who affectionately stroked his head and said, "Be good." Franz Joseph then turned to his parents. He knelt before his father, Franz Karl, the man who had just given him an empire. And where was Franz Karl? He stood in the background as he always had, a ghost at the feast, a spectator at his own son's coronation. This was Franz Karl's peak, his greatest game-changing victory. His renunciation, if it can be called a victory, was complete. He had successfully avoided the throne. His preference for a private life, which he had demonstrated for 46 years, was now his permanent reality. The dynasty was stabilized. His son, guided by the iron hand of Sophie and the new ruthless Prime Minister Schwarzenberg, would go on to crush the revolutions in Hungary and rule for the next 68 years. Franz Karl triumphed. He was free to retreat to Schönbrunn Palace, to his hunting lodges, to his quiet, semi-retired life. He had proven that his system of avoidance and passivity worked. He had preserved his family's legacy while securing his own personal peace. It was for him a perfect outcome. But this victory, this abdication born of weakness and manipulation, was a Pyrrhic one. It had been achieved at a cost he could not yet see. The cost of his own dignity, his agency, and his relevance, setting the stage for a long, slow, and humiliating decline into the very irrelevance he thought he craved. What does a man do when he has given away an empire? What does his life become when his one great defining act is one of refusal? For Archduke Franz Karl, the morning of December 3rd, 1848, must have been the strangest of his life. For the first time, the crushing weight of succession, the burden he had dreaded since his brother Ferdinand's ascension, was finally irrevocably lifted. He was free. But free to do what? This is where the central tragic paradox of his life begins, a paradox that is far more agonizing than the simple political act of abdication. He had in theory secured his family's future, but in practice he had just authored his own slow, social, and political death. He had traded a crown for a life of profound, echoing irrelevance, a velvet prison of his own choosing, where his every weakness would be magnified and his very manhood would be questioned by the whole of Europe. His new life was a hollow one, a pantomime of royalty. He retained his titles, his vast estates, his chambers in the palaces. He was, after all, the father of the emperor. But this new role was a void. His son, the 18-year-old Franz Joseph, was now at the Habsburg Palace working 18-hour days. He was a boy forced to become a man overnight, surrounded by ruthless, calculating advisors like Prince Schwarzenberg, who famously told the new emperor, "We will not be sentimental." They were busy crushing the last embers of the revolution, executing Hungarian generals, and building a new, iron-fisted, neo-absolutist state. And where was Franz Karl in this new, dynamic, and brutal regime? He was at Schönbrunn Palace, or at his favorite hunting lodge in Ischl, doing what he always did. He was hunting. His life became a string of endless, identical days, rising early for the hunt, attending mass, eating large meals, and perhaps taking a quiet walk with his wife. He was a man with a schedule, but no purpose. This is the heart of his Pyrrhic victory. He had won his peace, but it was the cold, silent peace of a museum exhibit. He was now a living relic in his own court. And in this vacuum of his own making, his formidable wife, Archduchess Sophie, did not fade away. She exploded in power. With her son on the throne, Sophie was no longer just an ambitious archduchess. She was the Kaiserin Mutter, the Empress Mother. And in the early years of Franz Joseph's reign, she was, without question, the most powerful woman in the empire, and arguably the most powerful person. She was the only man at court, as some courtiers whispered only half-jokingly. She had achieved her life's ambition. Her creation was on the throne, and she would be his guide. She moved her apartments next to his, she reviewed policy with him, she vetted his advisors, she managed his social life. She, along with Schwarzenberg, was the counter-revolution. This created a bizarre and humiliating new dynamic for Franz Karl. His wife, the woman who had shared his bed and who he had relied on for everything, was now, for all intents and purposes, the Shadow Empress, and he was reduced to the role of her consort. He was the appendage, the plus one. At state functions, he would stand beside her, this small, unassuming man, while she, towering in her ambition and intellect, conferred with generals and prime ministers. His passivity, which she had once used to her advantage to secure the throne for their son, was now a source of open public embarrassment. He was living proof that the new emperor, this strong, vigorous young man, came from weak stock. And this leads us to the darkest, most personal, and most humiliating consequence of his weakness: the whispers that his children were not his own. This is the dark secret that plagued his life, a rumor that could only exist because of his widely known frailty. To be a puppet prince was one thing. To be a puppet husband, a cuckold, was another. The rumor centered on one of the most romantic and tragic figures of the age, who was also living at the Austrian court, Napoleon II, the Duke of Reichstadt. He was the son of Napoleon Bonaparte himself, a virtual prisoner of gold in Vienna, and he was, by all accounts, charismatic, intelligent, melancholic, and utterly captivating. And he was very close to Archduchess Sophie. They were, on the surface, an unlikely pair. She was the ambitious Bavarian princess. He was the deposed French prince. But they were both outsiders, both intensely intelligent, and they shared a deep emotional bond. The Viennese court, a hotbed of gossip, watched this intense friendship with suspicion. And when Sophie, after 6 barren years with the feeble-minded Franz Karl, suddenly gave birth to a string of healthy, intelligent, and ambitious sons, the rumors began. The most potent of these rumors insisted that the second son, Ferdinand Maximilian, the dreamy, romantic, and decidedly un-Habsburg-like boy, was not Franz Karl's child at all, but the son of the Duke of Reichstadt. Whether this rumor was true is to this day a matter of intense historical debate. Most serious historians doubt it. Sophie's conservative piety and her dynastic ambition would likely never have allowed her to risk such a scandal. But the truth of the rumor is almost irrelevant. The fact of the rumor is what's important. It was a weapon of mass humiliation aimed directly at Franz Karl. It succeeded, and it was so widely believed, precisely because no one could imagine the brilliant, fiery Sophie being genuinely devoted to the simple, passive Franz Karl. The rumor framed him as a man who was not only too weak to rule an empire, but too weak to even command his wife's fidelity or to be the true father of his own sons. His intellectual and emotional frailty, his core fatal flaw, had made him a figure of pity and contempt, a joke in the courts of Europe. His abdication was not seen as a sacrifice. It was seen as an inevitability, the natural result of his pathetic inadequacy. This public humiliation, this slow erosion of his dignity, was the true ticking bomb of his life, and it poisoned his relationships with the very family he had sacrificed everything for. He became a non-entity in his own home. This was never more apparent than in the next great family drama, the arrival of Empress Elizabeth, or Sisi. In 1854, Franz Joseph, in a rare act of rebellion against his mother, fell madly in love with and insisted on marrying the 16-year-old Bavarian princess, Elizabeth Sisi. This set the stage for one of the most legendary rivalries in royal history. The iron-willed conservative Kaiserin Mutter, Sophie, versus the free-spirited, rebellious, and beautiful young Empress Sisi. It was a clash of titans, a battle of wills that would define the court for decades. And where was Archduke Franz Karl in this titanic struggle between his wife and his daughter-in-law? He was, as always, nowhere. He was a ghost in the palace, a piece of furniture. His opinion was not sought. His influence was non-existent. He was caught in the crossfire, but he was so irrelevant that no one even bothered to aim at him. He would sit at tense family dinners, a silent witness to the barbed comments, the icy stares, and the emotional warfare between Sophie and Sisi. His passivity had made him completely impotent, unable to defend his daughter-in-law, unable to soothe his wife, and unable to advise his son. He was simply there. This, then, was the ultimate betrayal. It was not a single dramatic backstab like the one he had experienced at Olamuk. It was a slow daily betrayal by his own family, a consequence of his own nature. His alliance with Sophie, which had been the defining partnership of his life, had cracked. Her ambition, once focused through him, was now focused entirely on her son and the preservation of the empire. Franz Karl, having served his purpose as the vessel for her heirs, was now discarded. He was her husband, and she likely remained in her own way fond of him. But he was no longer her partner. He was a problem she had solved, a man she had pensioned off. Even his son, the emperor, was part of this unintentional betrayal. Franz Joseph was a man defined by duty, a bureaucrat in chief who would read and sign papers for 12 hours a day. He revered the idea of the monarchy, and he publicly, unfailingly, showed his father the utmost respect. He was always His Imperial Highness, the Archduke Franz Karl. But privately, he never consulted him. Why would he? His father had proven his entire life that he had no interest in or aptitude for matters of state. The abdication, which was meant to empower his son, had also created a permanent, unbridgeable gulf between them. Franz Joseph would consult his ministers, his generals, and in the early days, his mother. But his father was the man who went hunting. This was the Pyrrhic victory in its totality. Franz Karl had won the peace he craved, but it was the desolate, lonely peace of total irrelevance. He had escaped the burden of the crown only to find himself trapped in a life without meaning. He was a living paradox, a prince of the blood who had no power, a husband to the most powerful woman at court who had no influence, and a father to the emperor who had no say. He was a ghost haunting the very palaces he had been born to rule, a living, breathing testament to the fact that in the unforgiving world of dynastic power, absolute passivity is not a virtue or even a choice. It is a form of suicide. And he would spend the remaining 3 decades of his life living out that long, slow, and agonizingly quiet death. The life of Archduke Franz Karl, after his great renunciation, became a long, quiet epilogue. He had stepped out of the path of history, and now history would simply happen around him, often with devastating consequences for his own family. He was the ghost in the palace, and as such, he became a silent witness to the spectacular failures and profound tragedies of his son's strong reign. His Pyrrhic victory of peace would be shattered, not by his own actions, but by the repercussions of the very ambition he had enabled. He wanted a quiet life, But the 1860s would bring his family nothing but horror. He watched, presumably in his gentle, confused way, as his son Franz Joseph, the strong ruler, led the empire into a series of catastrophic blunders. In 1859, the emperor was personally humiliated on the battlefields of Italy, losing the bloody Battle of Solferino and, with it, the province of Lombardy. But the true cataclysm came in 1866. Franz Joseph, in a squabble for dominance over the German-speaking lands, blundered into the Austro-Prussian War. At the Battle of Königgrätz, the Austrian army, once the pride of Europe, was utterly annihilated by the modern, efficient Prussian forces in a matter of weeks. The empire was shattered, its status as a great European power broken. The strong reign, the one Franz Karl had abdicated for, had led to a military humiliation worse than anything the 1848 revolutionaries could have dreamed of. And what was the consequence of this catastrophic failure? It was the ultimate bitter irony for Archduchess Sophie. In 1867, to save his crumbling empire from total collapse, Franz Joseph was forced to sign the Ausgleich, or compromise. This compromise granted Hungary, the very nation Sophie and the Camarilla had so brutally crushed in 1849, virtual independence. It split the realm in two, creating the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. The Hungarian revolutionaries, in essence, had won. Sophie, the arch-conservative, the believer in a centralized divine right empire, was forced to live to see her son give in to the very demands she had sacrificed her husband to prevent. Franz Karl, the man of peace, the man who might have been more open to compromise, had to sit by and watch as his son's unyielding strength led directly to the very concessions his wife had deemed unthinkable. But this political humiliation was nothing compared to the personal tragedy that struck the family that very same year. It was a blow from which Sophie, and perhaps Franz Karl as well, would never truly recover. It concerned their second son, his mother's darling, Ferdinand Maximilian. Maximilian, as romantic and ambitious as his father was passive, had been lured by Napoleon III of France into a doomed adventure to become the Emperor of Mexico. It was a fantasy, a puppet regime, propped up by French bayonets. When the French, under pressure, withdrew their troops, Maximilian's empire collapsed. In June 1867, he was captured by Republican forces, court-martialed, and executed by a firing squad in Querétaro. The news that reached Vienna was not just that the emperor's brother was dead, but that he had been murdered, a royal body riddled with bullets. It was a dynastic catastrophe. It destroyed Archduchess Sophie. Her ambition, which had successfully placed one son on a throne, had now led another son to a firing squad. She was, contemporaries said, worn out by grief, a broken woman. And Franz Karl? This simple, doting father who had loved his children, who had found his only true joy in his family? We have no record of his specific private grief, but it must have been bottomless. His son, the dreamy, beautiful boy who was so different from him, the boy rumored not to be his, was dead. This was the cost of the family's ambition. This was the dark underside of the strong dynasty he had yielded to. His quiet life of hunting and prayer was now permanently stained by the blood of his own child. After the execution of Maximilian, the light truly went out of the family. Sophie, once the only man at court, retreated from public life, a formidable figure now bowed by sorrow. She died in May 1872 from pneumonia at the age of 67. With her death, the central defining force of Franz Karl's life was gone. For 48 years, she had been his spine, his master, his advisor, his protector, and his partner in that strange, unequal marriage. He had lived in her shadow, a shadow of ambition and iron will. And now at 70 years of age, he was truly, completely alone. His final 6 years, from 1872 to 1878, were the true epilogue. He was now just an old man, a widower shuffling through the vast empty palaces, a figure from a bygone era. He was a grandfather to the crown prince, the brilliant but tragically unstable Rudolph. He was a father to the reigning emperor, who was now a solemn graying man, hardened by tragedy and the relentless burdens of the state. He continued his routines, he hunted, he prayed, he ate, but the great drama was over. He had outlived his wife, he had outlived his most promising son, and he had outlived his own relevance by 30 years. Archduke Franz Karl died on March 8th, 1878. He was 75 years old. His death, like his life, was quiet and mundane. He succumbed to the same ailment that had taken his wife, severe lung inflammation. He passed away in his apartments in Vienna, a quiet end for a man who had only ever wanted quiet. And this is perhaps the final and most devastating irony. His death, the death of the man who should have been emperor, created no power vacuum. It caused no political crisis. The Wiener Zeitung, the official gazette, published a respectful formal obituary. The court observed its required period of mourning. But the empire, the vast machinery of state, did not shudder. It did not pause. It did not even hiccup. There were no factions scrambling for influence, no panicked ministers. The power had long since shifted. His passing was a biological formality, the closing of a file, the final definitive proof that he had ceased to matter decades earlier. His greatest victory in Olamuk had been so complete that his own death was, in the end, a non-event. The chaotic legacy of Franz Karl is not in what he did, but in what he didn't do. His abdication, that single act meant to save the dynasty by installing a strong, uncompromising ruler, became the original sin of Franz Joseph's reign. It created a regime that was too rigid, too inflexible, and too committed to an outdated idea of autocracy to survive the modern world. Franz Joseph, the son he had empowered, would rule for 68 long, tragic years. He would lose war after war. He would see his beloved wife, Empress Sophie, assassinated by an anarchist in 1898. He would see his only son and heir, the brilliant liberal Crown Prince Rudolph, commit suicide in a murder pact at Mayerling in 1889. And this is the final crushing turn of the screw. With Rudolph's death, the line of succession was thrown into chaos. It passed ironically to Franz Karl's other son, Karl Ludwig, who was, in a tragic echo of his father, a deeply pious, unambitious man who also had no desire to rule. When Karl Ludwig died, the mantle of heir passed to his son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And so, in a direct, unbroken line, Franz Karl's abdication in 1848, an act designed to stop revolution, crush nationalism, and preserve the dynasty, ultimately led to a world where his own grandson, Franz Ferdinand, would be the heir. And it was the assassination of that grandson in Sarajevo by a nationalist that would ignite the very fires of World War I, the war that would utterly destroy the Habsburg dynasty and the entire 600-year-old empire forever. The very problems he had tried to avoid by his passivity returned, magnified 1,000 times, to consume his grandchildren and his entire world. So, who was Archduke Franz Karl? He was not a villain. He was not a hero. He was perhaps one of history's most tragic footnotes. He was a simple, gentle, and perhaps simple-minded man born into the wrong family at the wrong moment in history. His story is a profound human warning, not just about the dangers of ambition, but about the equal and perhaps greater dangers of passivity. His abdication was not a sacrifice. It was an escape, and in escaping his duty, he became a puppet, crushed by the ambitions of his wife and son, and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the very ruin he sought to avoid. He is the great what if of Austrian history. What if this gentle, unambitious man had found the courage, just for one day, to say no to his wife and yes to the crown? What if he had ruled? Would his kindness have been a balm for the revolutionary age? Would his willingness to compromise have saved the empire, or would his weakness have simply accelerated its collapse? We will never know. But his quiet, overshadowed life, this emperor who never was, serves as a timeless, poignant reminder that a life lived in fear, a life defined by what we refuse to do, can sometimes cause a far greater tragedy than a life of action. He was a man who gave away an empire, only to find that in doing so, he had lost himself.